So Cory is a research scientist with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. He obtained his Bachelor's of Science in Civil Engineering from Michigan State University and his Master's and PhD in Environmental Engineering from Michigan Tech. Cory, his work focuses on water quality and non-point source pollution. So I'll leave it off to you. Here's the clicker. That's advanced, and you got a laser pointer up top. Okay?
All right. Thanks, Mike. I'm going to kind of switch gears from a specific issue of groundwater quantity to one of groundwater quality, specifically nitrate concentrations in the shallow aquifer in Dane County. Just want to emphasize that what I'll be talking about here today is sort of one small part of a much larger project looking into this issue. So first off, I want to acknowledge my co-authors on that. They're all here with us today. So there's Mike and Ken, of course, Dick Lathrop, Kirsty Sorsa, and again, Mike Kokoska all contributed, especially to this larger issue that this is a piece of. So just for some context, I think a lot of the people in the room are probably at least somewhat familiar with this issue, but just to make sure we all understand why we're looking at nitrate in groundwater. It is the most common groundwater pollutant in the state of Wisconsin. And it's been estimated that it exceeds the human health standard of 10 milligrams per liter in about 10% of wells statewide. The reason it's considered a pollutant is primarily because of human health effects. The big one is this methemoglobinemia, or what's commonly known as blue baby syndrome. It's a disorder that occurs in infants. Essentially not enough oxygen can be carried in their blood. So that 10 milligrams per liter was really set to protect the health of infants, pregnant women. But there are some other potential concerns. There is some research out there looking at a potential link to cancer. There's some potential links to diabetes. So the human health science isn't that well understood. But in short, it's essentially a human health concern. Another thing that's important to note is that where there's nitrate, because as we'll kind of see as we get going here, a lot of the sources of this pollutant are agricultural in nature. Where there's elevated nitrate, there's probably a higher than average risk for other contaminants that may be associated with agricultural activities, such as pesticides. And then specific to Dane County, we mentioned the 10% exceedance rate statewide. Previous work has shown that in Dane County, that exceedance rate is at least 2 times the statewide average. So upwards of 25% of wells in previous studies have been tested in exceedance of that 10 milligrams per liter. Okay, so again, this is sort of a piece of a bigger project. The objectives of that project were these primary points. One, there's a whole lot of nitrate data out there from a number of different sources. One of our primary goals was just to pull all that together into one place and create sort of this master database of all the nitrate measurements of wells that have been collected over time. And I should emphasize that when I say wells, I'm referring primarily to shallow domestic wells, so mostly household wells. We're not really looking at municipal wells. We're not looking at things that go down into the confined aquifer here, the deep aquifer. Once all that data was put together, the next goal was to sort of look at, just identify spatial and temporal statistical trends. We'll look at some of those results briefly here. And then the final point, and this is where the Dane Country, I guess, groundwater model comes into play. We want to use that to characterize changes in nitrate loading, not just concentrations, but to try to sort of project things backwards and look at how loading has changed over time. And I think you'll see what I mean as we move forward here. So I will just spend a couple slides on some of the broader conclusions before we dig into the modeling part, just to get a sense of what this data set looks like. So these are the different sources of that data. They're available from different sources and different numbers. All these different data sets had maybe their own little biases, but when we put them all together, we end up with a pretty nice set of data. And I should emphasize that the 61,000 records that we had, those are only wells that passed sort of quality control. So in a lot of cases, we couldn't determine the location of the well unambiguously. So these are really just the high quality data. We ended up with over 60,000 records, spanning a time period from prior to 1980 to the present. And so that large data set was primarily used for mapping and some sort of coarse statistical trend analyses. And then we started sort of winnowing that down to even higher quality data. And the big distinction was made where we could identify well construction characteristics. So if we had the well, casing depth, static water table, that type of information, those sort of got partitioned off into a second data set. And that's really what we're able to use for the groundwater modeling that we'll look at. And that, just for context, is about 23,000 individual measurements of nitrate. That came from about 5,000 unique wells. And then within that data set, it's also important to realize that a big chunk of that can be attributed to public water supplies that are monitored annually. So they actually have a good long time series. But a lot of them, I mean, the majority of them are still an individual homeowner's well where you may only have a measurement at the time the well was drilled, or just a few sporadic measurements throughout time. So just to kind of look at what the spatial trends looked like, and just right off the bat, this isn't taking any sort of differences in well depth or anything like that into account. This is just taking the data from the wells where they are and mapping it out. And what we're looking at here is spatial averages, so spatially interpolated data. So it's important to note there's a lot of variability in this data over very small scales. So these are only the averages, and it's, there's a lot of, for example, high wells, wells with high nitrate concentrations in the blue parts of the map, just like there's a lot of low wells in the red parts of the map. But overall, this is sort of the spatial pattern we can pull out of this. And it's consistent, throughout these essentially 7 completely different data sets. We see sort of that same pattern. But even in the average, there's a lot of variability. So, there's parts of the county where the average is actually less than 2 milligrams per liter. There's parts of the county where the average concentration is actually greater than 14 milligrams per liter. And put this in context to the standard. Remember that 10 milligrams. So essentially all these orange and reddish colors are places where not just individual wells, but the actual spatial average of all the wells in that area is higher than the health standard. So once we had this all put together, one of our tasks was to figure out what's driving these patterns. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. If you're looking at this and if you're familiar with the county, which a lot of you are, you might be thinking it sort of looks like a land use association, and that's part of it. But what we really sort of settled on as a primary driver of these concentrations is hydrology. So the red lines here denote the groundwater divides, and we saw those in Mike's presentation earlier. And of course, the blue are the major surface water features. And the reason that this 5.2 milligrams per liter was chosen as a cutoff point here is that's the median of this data set. So in other words, 50% of this map is blue and 50% is red. And when you map it out that way, you start to see an association between the higher concentrations up higher in the landscape and the lower concentrations down lower in the landscape. And essentially what that is an effect of groundwater age. Down at these lower in the landscape, you tend to get older water coming up, sort of diluting the higher concentrations, whereas if you're up high in the landscape, it's basically just direct infiltration from that area, which is feeding the shallow aquifer. Okay, so that's sort of some of the bigger picture conclusions, but what I want to drill into is how can we assess and summarize concentration trends over time at the countywide scale? And this is where the model came in as a very useful tool. As I mentioned, a lot of the public water supplies do have good records over time, and ideally we would have a lot of records like this and be able to extrapolate to the whole county. Unfortunately, we don't. And I should mention, as part of this broader effort, we did look separately at these public water supplies and do sort of a separate trend analysis. We won't get into that here. So again, most wells might only be measured a few points in time. So when you kind of plot it all together, you just get a big mess. Again, time scale, this is starting in the 70s. We don't really start getting a lot of measurements until the late 80s. And then just sort of this cloud. So, can't just really fit a trend line through this. There's no significant trend there. And just a lot of factors making it difficult to interpret any sort of temporal trends from this raw data. I mean, we can sort of massage it different ways if we bin things annually. And for example, what I've plotted here is the percent of measurements that exceed that standard of 10 milligrams per liter. Then we do start to see some trends that are statistically significant. But we have to be very careful when we interpret things like this because there's a lot of potential biases in these raw well data. So some examples of that, I think as I mentioned, there's definitely a bias towards testing new wells. So wells, basically being tested at the time they're constructed. And then sort of following on that, there may be trends in the way wells are constructed, casings moving deeper over time, development happening in different parts of the county over time, so you get sort of these spatial biases mixed into the data. There's also just the issue that, and you kind of saw this in the previous plot, that over time more tests are happening. So you might be moving away from targeted testing in areas that might be problematic for whatever reason to just a more broad-based testing. So all these things could be sort of giving us apparent trends. And this is where the model comes in. So we just kind of take a step back and think about the character of this data. Each measurement can really be associated with 2 points or periods, I guess, in time. So one, and the only one we've been thinking about so far, is when the observation was made. So you take a sample from a well, take it to the lab, test it. So you have a date and a measurement, right? And we know that date. But the other sort of time component of each one of those samples, which we don't know, is when that water actually recharged, or when the last time that parcel of water in the well was in contact with a potential source of nitrate. So if we could somehow normalize to that second time component, or the age of water, that would allow for sort of an unbiased comparison of data collected from different types of wells, different depths over time. And all those sort of biases that we pointed out on the last slide would sort of go away. So if we just had an estimate of the age of water, it would really clean this data set up and help us sort of squeeze a lot more information out of it. So what that would do conceptually is take measured concentrations and associate them with some point in the past rather than when they were measured at the lab. So sort of termed this hindcasting, and I just want to kind of go through the process visually, kind of help clarify it in everyone's head. So again, here's a measurement, some theoretical well. We took one measurement in the year 2000, and the concentration was 5.4 milligrams per liter. Okay? If we knew somehow that the average age of water in that well could be estimated to be about 30 years, then we could take that data point and sort of slide it backwards in time 30 years. So instead of a point at 2000 and 5.4, we have a data point at 1970 and 5.4. So instead of a sample date, we could think of that as the hindcasted date of recharge, right? So that's all good and that makes sense, but there's one big problem, is that we don't actually have an easy way to estimate this for these 5,000 different wells. Okay, so that's the end to which we sort of applied the model, and Mike Parson earlier showed an example where particle tracking was used in a high cap well to delineate the recharge zone, and sort of showed that part of that intersected a historical landfill site. So that was backwards particle tracking, right? So that's something that you can do with high cap wells, place the particles in the model and sort of run them back in time and see where they come out at the surface. For this effort, we used forward particle tracking, and there's a couple reasons for that. One, again, we're dealing with small wells in the shallow aquifer. They don't pump at high enough rates, and generally they pump intermittently, so they're not really affecting the flow of groundwater. So one problem is if you try to do backwards particle tracing with them, you might not get a very accurate delineation of where the water came from. A bigger problem, again, is that there's 5,000 wells, so you'd have to individually place particles in each one of those wells. So the solution we came up with was to actually place a particle in every single model grid cell at the water table, and just run it forward until it either left the model domain or popped out in a surface water feature. And then we sort of tracked that and put it together in a big database, which ended up being 13.5 million different entries in this database, which just gave us a very comprehensive view of where water is moving through the whole county and the times associated with it. So once we had that, we could take our data set of wells where we know the depths and we know the casing depths. We can assign our open interval of each well, kind of query this big database of where particles have moved over time, and identify particles, like these three in this sort of cartoon, that end up intersecting this well at some point or another. From that particle tracing output, we also get the age of each particle when it hits the well. Okay? So then with that information and a number of other things such as hydraulic conductivity, I won't go into all the details, but we are able to sort of estimate an average recharge age for each well just based on looking at what particles sort of pass through where that well happens to be. Okay? So here's an example to kind of show what it looks like with real data. In this case, this green star is one of the wells that we had data for. And then sort of looking at that database of where all the particles moved, it said, well, the particles that were dropped into these grid cells at the surface or at the top of the water table are the ones that end up intersecting the open interval of that well. And the colors show the age of those particles when they get there. Okay, so you can see for this particular well, most of the water is kind of coming from this area, and it's between 24 and 33 years old. But because of where this one's located, and you'll see this sort of from the side in a second, there's also some water coming through this well that's much older and originates at a different area. And so when we go through our calculations with the different particles, we end up estimating that the average recharge age for that well is 44 years. And this is what it looks like from the side. So you can kind of see again, here's that well. Here's the cluster of cells where the sort of 24 to 33-year-old water comes from, and they move just through the shallow aquifer. And then those 3 points, you know, as you would expect, they do drop down into the deep aquifer, which is why they are so much older when they do get to the well. So just to sort of see what the summary statistics for that whole large data set of 5,000 wells, generally the ages were between, say, 5 and 20 years. Those are the average recharge ages. And then as you sort of start to get out in this tail, we're seeing situations like we just illustrated, where you're maybe getting a little bit of old, deeper groundwater coming up back to the surface and mixing in with that younger water. Give us these older ages. And of course, these, I mean, in some cases, we're probably actually punching down into the deeper aquifer. Okay, so kind of going back to the nitrate issue, now we have the data, we have the ages for all the data. We can plot things out, instead of just plotting things where they fell, where they were measured. We'll take all those data points and sort of shift them back in time and see if anything falls out of that. And as it turns out, things do fall out of that. Just to summarize what we're looking at here, these data are, again, binned annually. And the upper and lower tails of these error bars are the 25th and 75th percentile. And the dark bar in the middle is the median. So essentially, these are the boxes of box plots over time. So a few things to point out here. I mean, there's sort of, I think, good news and bad news. And one, just to sort of solidify in your head, we're looking at concentrations, but we can interpret it as sort of a proxy of loading over time, right? Because this concentration may have been measured up here, but we're going to just say it represents sort of the watershed conditions back here. So the most obvious feature, I guess, is this pretty big increase between, say, 1960 and 1980. And then more recently, I don't know if I'd quite say it's leveled off, but there's definitely sort of an inflection point around 1980, and the rate of increase has really changed. Now, one sort of encouraging sign is that the occurrence of really high concentrations of nitrate has decreased with the time of recharge. So you can see that 75th percentile kind of coming down pretty clearly in the last 10 years or so, which just means that upper 25th percentile is lower than it used to be. On the other hand, the incidence of sort of really low concentrations as they're associated with time is marching upwards pretty steadily. So there's this almost linear trend going all the way back to 1960 or 1970 in the 25th percentile. So showing now, 75% or so of wells are above 3 milligrams per liter with new water in them, I should say. So now we can take this trend and see if this can sort of tell us anything about sources or how things are reacting to potential sources over time. And this is what gets us to probably the most interesting finding that fell out of this analysis. If we take the historical record of inorganic or synthetic nitrogen fertilizer use over time, which is represented by this red line, and scale it and overlay it right on this sort of backcast proxy of nitrate loading to the shallow aquifer, you can see a pretty remarkable correlation between those two things. So not necessarily a new finding. I mean, I think there's general agreement that agricultural sources are the primary driver of these elevated nitrate concentrations, but this is just a really nice additional piece of evidence that shows us, that not only, okay, the source is the main driver, but the aquifer has responded really nicely to changes. So again, this sort of point in time around 1980, where it seems like concentrations started to level off, that corresponds in a sort of a leveling off of fertilizer use as well. So that's encouraging, I think. So in summary, the model, large-scale forward particle tracking, can be used to estimate the water age of a whole bunch of wells all at once, small, low-capacity wells. But I guess it's really important to emphasize that the level of accuracy we're probably getting is appropriate for this type of study where we're looking at a lot of data all at once. But the accuracy of these age predictions for any given well, might not be appropriate for a different use. We're kind of relying on the law of large numbers here. For a relatively conservative contaminant like nitrate, if we correct the data for travel time, again, it kind of gets rid of these biases in our big data set and lets us look at a proxy for historical loading conditions rather than current concentrations. And then finally, it's kind of a big finding that the reconstructed record of loading does correspond really well with records of nitrogen fertilizer use. Quick plug, as I mentioned, part of a much larger study. In a few weeks here, Kevin Connors has graciously allowed us to give a talk at the Dane County Land and Water Resource Division building over at Fen Oak. So this is going to be a brown bag talk where we'll kind of go over some of the same stuff, but some of the spatial and temporal statistical analysis in a lot more detail. We'll also look at some other things like changes in base flow and spring concentrations over time. So if you're interested in this topic, please attend this and talk about it a little more. And then finally, I definitely want to acknowledge DNR Drinking Water and Groundwater Bureau. They provided the major funding for this study. We had a couple additional funding sources. And then this whole list of folks here either provided data or assisted in the data analysis. I think with that, take some questions.
Just a round of applause for both speakers. We have time for questions if anyone has them. I can make my way around. In the back.
I think one of your conclusions in your study was that it seemed like nitrate levels in groundwater have kind of leveled off. And is that true?
Yeah, I mean, there's a few sort of encouraging signs. I think one of them, I go back, was again sort of this upper 75th percentile coming down, because that more reflects what's happening on the landscape rather than what we're actually measuring. If we go way back, so this is just the raw data. This is showing the number of wells tested that exceed 10 milligrams per liter, and this too is going down pretty steadily, again with all those caveats. But these are just sort of two separate lines of evidence that, yeah, there does seem to be some improvement.
With respect to bias, would it be true in the raw data that wells that had a high count would be likely to be retested and thus push the average artificially up?
Yes. Yes, absolutely. But I do want to, then emphasize that the advantage of using the model to backcast things is you kind of get rid of that because we associate it with the right point in time.
Okay.
Just sorry, sort of curious. One of the maps showed these kind of hot spots. Could that be used to kind of target some remediation efforts or different localized planning?
Yeah, I don't know about remediation per se. I mean, I think so. I wouldn't be the authority on that. But in terms of just encouraging well testing among homeowners too, I didn't say it, but the rate of well testing is pretty low given the magnitude of the issue here. But that said, because those are spatial averages, and there is really a lot of variability in the data, I would also caution against sort of over-relying on those maps, just because, pretty much anywhere in the county, it's quite possible that you could have a very high nitrate concentration.
I was wondering how well were the wells spatially distributed around the county? When you're looking at the map trends, are some of them vague and others a lot more concentrated and perhaps more accurate?
No, with the exception of, so this early data down here, that was pretty sparse. The rest of them are, we have a figure that actually plots where the different wells are, and there's very good coverage countywide.
Any other final questions? Jeff?
One other caveat to the nitrate data is that in more recent years, wells have tended to be drilled deeper to get away from nitrate problems, specifically and more likely in areas where nitrate's a problem. So just another thing that skews the data a bit.
Right. But, and to follow up, and that is one other thing that using the age sort of corrects for, because the depth doesn't matter so much anymore. It's all sort of wrapped up in that age calculation.
Other question? Is that it? And again, we'll be around at the end to field more questions, and you know where to find us. So again, just another round of applause for the guest speakers.